Hi, good evening, and welcome on our Thursday talk. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Joyce Okombo. Every Thursday, I like to bring a subject that is relevant to you in English, and I will repeat the same subject in Portuguese on Mondays. Today, we're going to speak about a life of endurance, and we're going to look at what role suffering plays in this. And you might have realized it, but we're busy with a series on growing spiritually, how we can grow spiritually, and how we can intentionally use spiritual disciplines to grow. We've been busy with this series for quite a while, and today is the last one. Today we're going to finish off with endurance and what role suffering plays, and we're going to look at our big example of faith, Abraham. We all need endurance to finish this race well, this life well. But before we're going to jump into the subject today, I just want to invite you, if you're listening live or in replay, if you're listening live, let's start with that. Just tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what the weather is like there. Here it is. It was cloudy, but the sun came through, so I'm really happy about that. And if you're listening on the replay, just put down #replay or tell me where you're listening from anyway. It's great to know who's listening. It's great to know you guys a little bit more because obviously I can't see you. So it just makes this a little bit more personal. As well, I want to invite you just to interact with me while I will be talking. I'll try to put some questions out to think about together. What I'm sharing with you today is from the book from John Ortberg, Living the Life You Always Wanted. And it's an awesome book, and I'm really excited to share today's subject on endurance. And I think it's something really relevant. I believe that all of us have in some way or another suffered or experienced hardship due to the COVID-19. Most of us are still really in it. Some countries suffer more than others. So I do think this is very relevant to talk today about how we can grow even in the midst of suffering, how we can spiritually grow even in the midst of suffering. If you are excited about it, like I am, just put down yes or yay or whatever expression or emoji that expresses your excitement. Drop it down here, and let's start. So I want to start off with asking you this question. Are there anyone out here listening that loves to run? Are you someone who loves to run? If so, just put your hand up. You have to put an emoji or say yes or say, I love running. Is there anyone out here listening that has ever run a marathon? I'm really curious to know, because our example has to do with this. I myself, I don't enjoy running at all. So, but my husband does. And yesterday, I think he went running, and he got back really excited because he ran 2 minutes faster than he did the other time he ran. So he saw progress, and he was really excited about it. But the example that I want to use right now is when you start off or when you run a marathon. I've never done it. If you do, maybe you can add a little bit of your experience here. But I believe that at the start, it is fun to run. And at the start of a marathon, you're all motivated. You have adrenaline going through your body, and you're just so excited to go at it. It's fun, and you have full energy. But then there's a point in the middle where your legs or your feet start protesting. They don't want to go. There's this point that like everything in you wants to quit. And I believe that runners call this hitting the wall. And at this point, you get tested. At this point, it's really a test. Will you keep going? And it is, for runners, it is this, they pass the test when they can continue running and can finish the race. And I think at a marathon, a lot of people that are finished this marathon, they don't finish in that well state. Some do, but most come back or arrive in the finish line quite exhausted. But we want to finish our race well. We want to finish this life, this Christian life. We want to live it well. So how can we live and finish well? No. Okay, maybe you can think with me. how can we live and finish this race well? What will help us? And I know the title already says where I'm going. So one of the things that we need is endurance. It's not the only thing, but one of the things we need is endurance. And I want to read with you Hebrews 12, verse 1. Oops, I didn't put my notifications off. I'm just first going to quit the notifications, else it would disturb. Done. Okay, Hebrews 12, verse 1 till 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such a position from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Whoa, I love this passage. And the question is, how do we develop perseverance? How can we develop perseverance? So maybe if you want to put down how you think we can develop perseverance, I invite you to write it down. But one of the ways that we can do it, that perseverance is produced and developed in our life, or could be, is through hardship and suffering. And hardship and suffering always changes us, but it doesn't always change us for the good. So here is really key, the way we respond to hardship and suffering. Our response to it will determine whether we will be changed for good, in a good way or not. So it's very important the way we respond to suffering and hardship. And we can grow in those, in suffering and hardship, when we have the right attitude and response to it. And therefore, I would really love to look to the example of Abraham. Abraham in the Bible, he got this big promise. He got the promise that he would be father of a big nation, and that his offspring would be as numerous as the sand of the sea. No, the sand on the shore, and the stars in the sky. But there was one problem, and that was that Sarah, his wife, she was barren. She couldn't have children, and that was a big issue for that promise to come true. But God still promised that he would, through Sarah, give Abraham a son, and that would turn out to become a big nation. And when we see Abraham's life, Abraham shows us a faith and endurance that is not doubt-free certainty. He doesn't live a life where he's so certain without any doubts. I invite you to read his story. It will really inspire and encourage you. Reread it. And Abraham shows us that sometimes living a life of endurance means that we need to walk in the dark and just not quit, that we need to continue walking in obedience even when we don't see the outcome. And that is what Abraham did. If we look at James 1, I think verse 3, it might be 2, 3, but in that passage it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of many kinds, because you know that testing of your faith develops perseverance. Allow perseverance to finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So Abraham, he passed through a testing of his faith, because we hear that when God made this promise, eventually it happened. And Sarah, she had a son when she was very old. I think she was about 19 years old, and Abraham 100. And they finally had this son, this promise. But then God asks something of Abraham that just scatters his dreams, his hope. God asks him to sacrifice his son, the promise, to sacrifice this. So this means that Abraham won't be only sacrificing his own son, but also his dream, his promise, everything for the future. And we see that Abraham's response is, "Here I am." When God calls him, he says, "Here I am." And this is not like, "Hey God, I'm here behind the tree." It's not saying where he physically is. It's saying like, "I am at your service." I will face this. I will not run from it. This is the attitude and response that Abraham had in the face of suffering, of hardship. It was the hardest thing for him to first gain the promise and then have to give it up again. But still, he said, here I am at your service. I will go through this. I will continue in obedience and I continue to follow you. And this is the right response to suffering and hardship. But let us just look at the model, how Abraham models endurance for us, because I want you to get the full picture. So first and for all, Abraham models us endurance in confusion. He endured even with the whole confusion in his mind because he got this great promise. But now God, who made the promise, asks him to sacrifice his son that is the fulfillment of the promise. So it's such a confusing situation. And maybe you are passing through a situation right now that is confusing. And you have to have endurance in this very confusing situation when God gave you a promise and you see things happening the opposite way in your life than God's promise, and you are so confused about this. If that is you, just drop down a 1. Just put 1 in the comments. If this is you, if you find yourself in this situation that you are in confusion about what God said and what is happening around you, because this is where Abraham was. But still in this situation where he suffered in this confusion, he showed that he continued going. His yes was still on the table. He was still following God in obedience. The second situation in which we see that Abraham models endurance is in doubt. If we look at his life, we can see how his actions didn't always show such a certainty of what God has promised him. We see that how he lied about his wife, that she was his sister, because he was scared what the men might do to him and to her. More about himself, I think, in the situation. But anyway, he tried to get the promise himself by sleeping with the concubine of his wife. So we can see that he had a lot of questions and doubts around the promise of God. But even in this, although he did many things wrong, he made many mistakes, he did one thing well, and that's he remained obedient. He remained going and putting his faith in God with stumbling, but he was still going. He was still running this race. And maybe you are right now in a situation where you're facing questions and doubts in your spiritual life, in your growth, in what's happening around you, and what's happening right now in your life or in the world. If that is you, just put down 2, and just know that even in this, Abraham shows us that it is possible. And it's not only him, but so many other examples show us that we can endure even in doubt, that we can be faithful. I'm so sorry, the notifications are apparently not off, turned off. Anyway, his example shows us that we can remain obedient even when we don't fully understand what is happening around us. The third thing that he models for us, his example models, is endurance in loneliness. There are what you go through in life, there's always other people that go through the same thing. But at the same time, when Abraham was walking towards the Mount Moriah, I think it was the name Moriah, he had his son by his side and he was with a servant, but still he was alone with his suffering because he couldn't share it with somebody else, because eventually he had to walk this road and not anyone else. The most painful part of suffering is that we have to carry it alone, in the sense or we have this sense of loneliness in carrying it, because it's still us that needs to walk through it. Other people can have empathy with us, they can comfort us, they can pray for us, but eventually we need to walk the walk. We need to walk through this suffering, and this can feel like a very lonely place. And We can see this in Abraham's life in that moment when he had to go these 3 days that he was walking, and that he was in mind thinking, I will have to sacrifice my son, but this is God's promise. I waited so long on this son, and all the promise hangs on his life. So he might have felt very lonely in this moment. But even in this, he endured. So we can see again, once again, his response of faithfulness, of his response of continuing having hope. So if you find yourself in this place of loneliness, that you feel that you're in hardship and you experience this loneliness and this hardship, just put down, if you feel comfortable with this, drop down a tree. It's only if you feel comfortable with it, of course. But the fourth thing, sometimes we need to endure in unanswered prayers. And Abraham, for a long time of his life, he had to face this unanswered prayer, this desire to have a child, Sarah, this desire to have a child, a son, but it wasn't happening. And eventually it did happen in their life. And we know people that sometimes certain prayers don't get answered, and we can endure even in those moments and continue going, obedient, walking with God. And lastly, Abraham shows us that we can endure even when all seems lost. On this moment that he had to climb the mountain, on this moment that he had to sacrifice, that the moment was there, now it's just me and my son. We're going up this mountain and there's nothing else. There's no other sacrifice. And still in this moment, he says to his servants that he leaves at the foot of the mountain. He says, we will return. Wait here. We will return. So there was still this hope that somehow God will fulfill his promise. Somehow God will come through and do something that will fulfill the promise. And so he kept hoping even when all seems lost. So we can endure, we can continue in hope even when all seems lost. If you feel in that situation, just put down a 4, or I think we're at 5 already, 5. Know that suffering endured in faith produces perseverance. So it's not just suffering on its own that that produces perseverance. It's when we go through it with faith, in faith. So this is just this great example, but now what can we practically do? How can we grow in suffering? How can we learn to grow in suffering? How can we practice this to grow in moments of suffering and pain? So what can we do? We can start with being faithful in the little burdens and annoyances of life. We all know them. Maybe, right now, having the limits happening, some countries are still in lockdown, others are getting out of lockdown, but everything is limited. Lisbon, 19 districts are once again in lockdown. So this can bring annoyances, burdens. This can bring suffering again and hardships financially and other ways. Maybe you had a holiday planned and your flight got canceled. You can practice endurance in these moments. You can practice how you will respond to them. You can practice your response, that you will continue responding in a way that brings honor to God in those moments. Or maybe you're struggling in a relationship right now. Maybe it's just something smaller, like someone has promised something to you and didn't stick through the promise, and you're annoyed with this. And these are some little annoyances and hardships that we can practice to endure in. And here will be the biggest thing is the way we react to them, how we respond to those things in our lives. So how will you respond when the little annoyances of life happen? So start with this week, just looking at how you respond to little hardships, little things that happens in your life, and look at if that response is something positive, or maybe you should adjust a little bit your attitude in these moments and ask God for help. Never give up in prayer. Be relentless in prayer when you face hardships and suffering. So I want to finish off with asking, what is the biggest challenge in your life now? Think about what is your biggest challenge right now. maybe there's a dilemma that you are facing right now, a decision that you have to make and you're not really sure what the right decision is. Or maybe you have been hoping and trusting for something for so long and you're ready to give up, and you need endurance in those moments. So yeah, just think about those things. You can share it here if you want to, but I know these are more personal things, and it's not always easy to share these things on these platforms. But just decide to be relentless in prayer, and how you will respond to suffering. Suffering will, will determine if you will grow in endurance, if this will be a moment that you can grow in or not. And our biggest example is Jesus, who took on the suffering on him, with the joy in mind that was before him. So I hope this was of value for you today. If you have listened and this was of value, just put down value, or share a little bit about what you're going through, if you feel comfortable with this. But this was it for tonight. It's like always a pleasure to be with you, and have a great evening. Bye bye.